Okay, so we're going to continue with the Parliaments. First thing to talk about is Parliamentary Competencies. In Article 117 of the Constitution, there's a list of competencies that are exclusive to the Parliament. These are very important competencies. So this means only the Parliament can make laws on these specific competencies. Now these are considered fundamental prerogatives of sovereignty. And remember, we as the people have the sovereignty originally, and we voted for the parliamentarians who derive the sovereignty from us, and so they're supposed to express our will, and so they must be able to make laws on these fundamental prerogatives of sovereignty. And we're talking about foreign policy, defence, public order, justice, citizenship, civil rights, criminality, the things that really are important for a state in terms of its identity of who it is. Remember also, we do share this sovereignty with the European Union. So following this list in the Constitution, it also says that the competencies are shared with the region and the European Union. But with these fundamental competencies of sovereignty, they belong to the state, which is Parliament, and are shared with the European Union. So the European Union can have a say, for example, on foreign policy. There is a commissioner, a European Commissioner of High Affairs, which is there to administer the laws made by the European Parliament on foreign policy, for example. But also there are shared competencies with the regions. It also says this after the list of exclusive competencies for parliaments, that the certain competencies are shared with the regions. For example, we've got a little list here. You've got health, also education is an example, transport, for example, to give you an example, or in education, Renzi made a big school reform, buona scuola, and there he enacted lots of different aspects to education, so that the state really disciplined how the education was going to progress, how it was going to be organised. But the regions, maybe they have a lot of activity with the Chinese in their territory. Maybe in Piemonte we've got lots of cooperation with China, and we need Chinese speakers. So in that case, the regions can introduce more schools oriented at learning the Chinese language. So we can see, there are specific local needs that will need a certain orientation of the services provided. Maybe could be health. You might have a lot of old people, so you need health to be done in a certain way, or even transport and education can be completely different from region to region. So you do need a little bit of diversity, and the regions can make laws on these, as well as the Parliament. In the case of regions, the regions are subordinate to the parliamentary laws, but in the case of European law, the Parliament is actually subordinate to the European law. So the Parliament cannot make laws, for example, on work. Europe makes a lot of laws in the area of work, on the subject of work, and Parliament can't contradict those laws with its own laws, for example. Okay, during the lesson we will be discussing women in Parliament and how this has changed Parliament with more women, and how we can introduce more women and why there aren't so many women, and we've got a few things to discuss there and how Parliament would change if it does have more women. The regulation of each house is decided by each house. So each chamber votes for its own regulation. There's an absolute majority in this case needed for the regulation. Absolute majority means that a majority of the members of the House, and not just those present, all the members, some may be absent. We want more than 50% of all members. So it's a higher bar than a simple majority. A simple majority is all more than 50% of those present. So that's a bit easy. So this is quite important, this regulation. This regulation will really help the work to proceed. They've got to make proposal of laws, they've got lots of commissions that are investigating and making proposals and analysing, and then they need to discuss, the representatives in Parliament need to discuss proposals of laws, and they need to vote, and they need to be able to intervene sometimes and amend, and there's all this that needs to be disciplined, and this needs to be done through regulation of the House. Now, if we think about the sources of law, remember the sources of law, you've got at the top, you've got the Constitution, the hierarchy of the European Union, the Constitution, the Parliament, the regional law, etc. You've got this hierarchy, the source of the regulation of the House is actually just under the Constitution, so it's it's subordinate to the Constitution but superior to the ordinary law. And the Constitutional Court has said that it cannot pronounce, it cannot judge the regulation, whether it's constitutional or not, because each house has an autonomy, even though the regulation must not contradict the Constitution. It cannot be judged by the Constitutional Court because of the separation of powers, because the legislative power must be separate from the judicial power, and even the accounts, the budget of each house cannot be judged by the Court dei Conti, by the accounts court, because again it needs this separation, it needs its autonomy. The Parliament must be autonomous and totally freed from the other powers. In England, we've got the same, the same regulation, is decided by the House, but there is a kind of constitutional aspect to it. There's a continuity, convention, prassi, we say in Italy, to the regulations. The regulations are all written down. There's a book on the parliamentary practice. It's called Parliamentary Practice, and it's got all the way Parliament proceeds. And this is written by a constitutional expert. We don't have a written constitution as such, but this is considered a constitutional document, even though, like anything in England with the Constitution, it's not. There's no one perspective. It's just an opinion. It can be changed like that. One rule in the House of Commons in England is you cannot call another member of Parliament a liar, because there must be a certain minimum respect shown. So you can't call them a liar, and if you call them a liar and you don't retract it, you can be kicked out. You can be thrown out and barred for a certain amount of sessions. So it's quite important, this. During Brexit, there was a big constitutional crisis because normally the government decides the diary of the Parliament, what it discusses, when it discusses, etc. And the government didn't want to discuss Brexit, the proposed withdrawal treaty, because it just wanted to push it through without a scrutiny, shall we say. And the Speaker of the House of Commons said, and he's just, he's not any higher authority, but he said, the Parliament must have its say, and so he kind of changed the Constitution in a way, because he insisted the Parliament decides the diary of the Parliament from then on about this Brexit. And in the end, it was the Parliament deciding what it was to vote on, when it was to vote on it, etc., and it took it out of the hands of the government. So this was a constitutional change decided by the leader of the House, which was the Speaker, and a very important regulation. So these are important. Each chamber has a president, and this again is decided by absolute majority by the House itself, of which he is a member, and then he can, or she can, direct discussions and order, check that the rules are being respected, call people to order, close votes, etc. So he or she have a lot of responsibility of directing the House. Now, you have plenary assemblies, and this is where all the proposals of law, the disegni di legge, are discussed and voted on. So this is where really the action is, in terms of polemics and big speeches and emotions, people, really letting their lyrical side free and trying to inspire people to follow their direction. And this is all done in the plenary assembly, so very important part of Parliament. Then you've got the committees. The committees can be, we need in Parliament, we really need a contact with reality. So we don't want Parliament to become this little world of its own, and we really need it to keep an idea of what the reality is. Remember, it's making laws for us, so it really needs to understand our reality. And for that purpose, we have these committees looking at what's happening and what is needed, what laws are needed, what needs to be changed, how can we resolve problems that arise in the country. You've got these committees, you've got permanent committees, which are committees which deal with specific subjects like health, foreign affairs, defence, etc. And they'll be looking at, for education, for example, they'll be looking at what's working, what are the problems, what could help, what proposals could be made to help improve education, etc. Then you've got bicameral committees, which are made from both houses. So you've got the Senate and deputies on those, and they're for very important and urgent matters. So, for example, with COVID, you would have had a bicameral committee looking at COVID. What are the scientists saying? What's needed to resolve the problems of COVID? These committees have powers to call, to convocare, to call different experts, different scientists. For example, with Renzi and his Buona Scuola, he would have talked to maybe in the permanent committee, in the education committee, they would have talked to headmasters and even leaders of industry. Maybe leaders of industry would have said, we need students that understand the world of work. So that from that evolved this idea of alternanza scuola lavoro, for example. By looking at this part of Italy and how it's working, what it needs, these committees can really change things. And then you've got select committees which carry out investigations on specific problems, like, for example, I've written mafia. For example, how to resolve these problems. Maybe the select committees will be looking at what the police are doing. They'll be calling police chiefs and looking at what's happening on the ground, what crimes have been happening, and what needs to be done to stop or prevent these crimes. All these committees reflect the composition of Parliament. So Parliament will have a certain orientation, maybe 40% left and 60% right, or maybe 20% green, etc. And these committees will really mirror Parliament's composition, because we really need to have the same orientation as Parliament. For Parliament, it would be impossible for 630 people to really discuss and interview different members of the public and really investigate together. So we need a smaller group, and that is these committees, but we need the same political orientation or composition of the political orientation as the representatives of Parliament, obviously. Now, you've got parliamentary groups. These are the groups in the Senate or the Camera dei Deputati that contain all the different political parties in that group. So maybe there's one group with PD, Cinque Stelle, and all the other parties in that specific group, and these groups are pitted against, in competition with, the other groups during the election. In the election, we did need to create parliamentary groups, because in the past, having very fragmented political groups, parties, meant a lot of governments fell, and coalitions couldn't hold together. So we needed to create this incentive for parties to stay together. So a parliamentary group would receive an extra, if it reached 50%, it would receive extra representatives, and very small parties outside a parliamentary group cannot be represented in Parliament if they get under a certain percentage, etc. So there's this incentive to create these big blocks which bring more stability to the government. And these parliamentary groups can form a part of the Parliament, which can have a leader and so help organise Parliament. So the leaders, maybe the leaders can meet of the parliamentary groups to have a conference if they decide, I don't know, maybe they want to form a national unity government because of COVID, which they did, and so they needed to call, Draghi had to call all the leaders together and form a conference of these leaders, these group leaders, to try to discuss terms in which they would join a national unity government, for example. Or maybe there's a big problem with the government falling and they have to decide whether they can continue with that specific parliament, or does it need to be dissolved, and the President of the Republic would get all the leaders together, the group leaders, and discuss their positions, and could they come together as a coalition to form another government or not. So they're very important, these parliamentary groups, and recognising them as a specific organ within the Parliament.